Okay, well, I'll start with one question, Molly. One thing that came up is this term circulating collection or circulating museum, and your description of Catherine Dryer's interest in this idea of traveling shows or portability or distribution. And it came to my mind that the model of, and especially that it was going to a college, came to my mind that Electronic Arts Intermix and the Video Data Bank in Chicago, that those archives were structured or are structured to distribute films often to educational situations. And you've been involved with a number of traveling projects, and it makes me wonder whether museums should have that as a mission of, let's say, distributing, in certain cases, let's say, an exhibition as a kind of educational process, and you know, not just, let's say, to share exhibitions with other museums, but to like send things out to educational institutions. Do you think that that's an interesting possibility today?
I do. Oh my, excuse me. I do. But I think the issue now has to. When I first began to teach film, I also got films from MoMA. Right, you know, they had a rental service in the circulating film, and I don't think they called it video yet. And MoMA had also a policy of traveling exhibitions that was very active in the 1930s. Vassar took shows regularly from MoMA, but that's another story. Now, why that doesn't happen now, I think probably has more to do with insurance and shipping costs. But it's too bad because, and I suppose works on paper could go more cheaply and so on. But it's too bad because it's a sort of the small, mobile, dynamic invasion can be really good, and also it gives, and you can see from the sketch I made that actually when you go into a school situation, there are going to be people who can answer back, and it produces a different kind of exchange than a formal museum would have. So it's, I think that's something to think about, actually. Although there are different sort of systems of distribution and circulation now. I mean, you could do a lot on the internet, I think, if you wanted to, with these sorts of ideas. But to bring the physical object, I think, is still pretty important, because everything can't go into the zone of reproduction.
Yeah, I've had a fantasy as an artist a number of times to create a contract where I would waive all insurance requirements on my work, and that to encourage its transmissibility, or that's not the right word, but it's the potential for it to be shown. Is there any other questions?
I have a question. I'm right next to Molly yelling. Molly, I wonder if you thought at all about, since you're from Vassar, is there a gendered aspect to bringing these exhibitions to Vassar as a women's college? Also thinking about the fact that the Société collection winds up at at the brother institution to Vassar. That may be too much local knowledge, but what does it mean for the Société Anonyme shows to be happening at a women's college, I guess, is the simplest form of what I'm asking.
Well, you'll remember that Thorstein Veblen wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, which, maybe you'll get into this, Richard, gave the role of the consumption of culture to women very clearly. And if you look at the way in which institutions of modern art start to develop in the United States, women are very active. I mean, MoMA is basically put together through the work of 3 women. And then they find their gentlemen friends at Harvard to put the business structure down and so on, and Alfred Barr is brought in. But the fact that the province of culture was thought to belong to women was something, I think it was just in the culture at a very profound level, and it had been that way for a while. So, and as far as the Société Anonyme going to Yale, well, Yale had the money. And also, I think there was a neighborhood factor. Catherine was in Connecticut. Just nearby, says Jennifer.
support your thesis, Molly. Actually, those two shows at Vassar were, and self-stated, very influential on Alfred Barr. He credits seeing those shows at Vassar as setting up his vision for what MoMA would then do, and much later credits Dreyer for that. But the whole educational mission side of it really was Catherine's focus for Société Anonyme throughout. And she modeled the structure of their programming and the lending on Herwarth Walden's Der Sturm project. And so she very actively met with him and was modeling the early programmatic initiatives and lending ideas on what he had already been doing in Germany. But that was Catherine's passion, absolutely, for Société for the entire duration. And in depositing the collection, which initially they hadn't really thought they were going to make a collection. It really, I mean, those same Kandinsky paintings she carried under her arm in the subway in New York to lecture from, because she felt the primacy of the power of the art object was so important, whether that was a lunchtime talk with the Women's Trade Union and numerous other audiences, that in fact, there was nothing that could replace what the artwork itself could do in terms of speaking to the viewer and being transformative culturally. But that was the raison d'etre for her involvement with the organization, and ultimately was what she hoped that Yale would do, is that they would just continue. There was the built-in audience of students at Yale, but the university did commit to lending perpetually out of the collection. And initially, while Duchamp was still alive and active, and up until her death, they did curate a number of small exhibitions that did go continuously across the country.
And the only thing I would add to that is that it's interesting about Barr, because he's certainly not a true believer while the show is up. And, you know, one of the things to remember about the experience of art that is brand new, is, especially in this period, is that people expected it to be difficult, but it was a kind of, you could have an experience that came with a delay. And I think that idea of the delay is useful in terms of thinking about reception questions. You know, there's not an instant, I get it. It's, you know, like the kinds of delays that come with philosophy as you chew on it and let it settle. It becomes more comprehensible, maybe. Or maybe you just need more time.
Signal we're out.
We're out of time?
Yeah.
Good.
I'm sorry.
No, I'll tell Melanie.
Let me go. Hi, my name is Richard Meyer, and I'm an academic art historian, which I mention because I was not only not trained as a curator, but I was trained not to be a curator. That is, there was some antipathy to the idea of museum professions as a outcome of the PhD studies that I was pursuing long ago, 20 years ago plus. But I mention this because I did end up at I've guest curated several shows in the interim, I mean, defying this, doctrine. And the first one was at the Whitney Museum. It was a small show of a realist artist from the 1930s. And it occurred to me as we were finishing, getting close to the actual installation of the gallery, all the loans had been secured. We had written the wall text. We had decided more or less on the sequence. We had decided, in fact, on the sequence of works. But what hadn't yet been decided was the exact color that the wall would be, if there would be a bench or other furniture in the space, and what the lighting, how we would not just direct the lighting, but anyway, what the lighting would be like. And a couple of other little things that seemed to me like questions of interior decoration. How to make a group of objects in a particular room look their absolute best with, depending on color, lighting, other atmospherics, texture. And when I mentioned this to a professional curator at the Whitney, actually the curator of the permanent collection, he's now the director of the Whitney, in fact, he was not happy with this metaphor or analogy. You know, he did not want to be likened to an interior decorator. And this got me thinking at the time about why interior decorating should be so, what's the word? Like stigmatized or degraded in relation to, let's say, curating, much less the category of art or of making art, or of architecture for that matter, and in making a building. And I think this has to do a lot with sort of biases against surface treatments versus structure, lots of different things, effeminacy, the feminization of decor. But for me, it opened on to a whole, what might be called secret history of modernism that I've remained interested in, and that I got a certain purchase on, I hope, through the Société Anonyme, by thinking about, well, what else was in the room, in a particular room, whether usually this would be a private room, I mean a room in a private home. What, for example, else was in Catherine Dreyer's home, besides the Léger painting and the Brancusi sculpture? And how might we begin to think differently about the history of modernism if we included the history of decor and of interior decoration as part of that, rather than always sort of removing the object from the surround, the domestic surround, usually what is first, a private or domestic surround. It's nowadays museums buy things, and actually even at the time, MoMA was buying things, but for the most part, works of modernist art would have been seen first in some kind, if they were sold at all. And that might only be in the artist's space, domestic or studio or domestic surround, but it could very often be in a collector's. And Catherine Dreyer is interesting because she both was an artist and a collector and this curator, a very visionary curator. So if you look at the second image on your handout, and someone please tell me if I eat up my, or when I eat up my 15 minutes. So I hate, anyway, going over. So I'm showing you, there are lots of different pictures I could have chosen, but this is one of my favorites. A late picture of Catherine Dreyer in her Connecticut home. And you see that she, anyway, has this elevator that she's cranking up, or pulling up. You see the pulley on the elevator. That wallpaper design with those large leaves, she actually asked Marcel Duchamp to match that wallpaper design precisely, and he did, although you can't see it from this angle, and he painted the elevator with that same. So even the fact that you would ask Duchamp to match your wallpaper pattern for your elevator already suggests, I think, a certain, I don't want to say queering because that brings up all, but a certain kind of surprising relation to an avant-garde artist and his labor within your own home as a collector, but also importantly, it is to say as a fellow artist. She's both a collector and an artist. And if you look on the left, I'm not going to read you because I wrote about this in an article that George Baker very kindly encouraged me through a lot of months that I needed encouragement to write and then to finish, called Big Middle Class Modernism, which is a sort of paraphrase of a quote from Catherine Dreyer. But I wrote about this at length, and so I'm not going to read it here. You can read the article. But that is a Brancusi. Do you see the Brancusi sculpture next to the? It's a little hard to make out the art in this surround because there's so much going on with the wallpaper and the curtains. But there's a Brancusi sculpture, and then there is a Léger, really nice Léger painting right next on the other side of the window. Can you sort of make that out behind the staircase? And what I'm showing you on the left, when I was finishing the article, I actually had reason to go. I mean, the reason was because I wanted to see the painting. It wasn't, but anyway, I went to the Metropolitan Museum, which is where this Three Women in a Garden, I think it's called, this painting now hangs. So I'm showing you on the left the galleries of the Metropolitan, this would have been 3 or 4 or 5, when did this, 5 years ago? Anyway, yeah, the galleries I think have been rehung. I'm sure they've been rehung since then. But you see that there's a better known Léger painting, Woman with a Cat, I think it's called, to the right, and then there's a Baltus in the gallery, sort of beckoning. But one of the things I thought about when I went to the Met was how cleaned up and sort of sanitized, and in a way, sadly to my mind, kind of vacuumed out the space had become, because the Met galleries, like most museum galleries, modern galleries, are a progression from one work, you know, as understandably, from one work of art to the next. You don't really get a sense of the history of the domestic life of this artwork before it entered into the Met's collection. But if you did, I was just thinking how amazing that would be somehow to be able to inject a little bit of her crazy wallpaper and hand-cranked elevator into the space of modernism at the Metropolitan Museum. So I thought I would end by just mentioning, so as I say, I'm very interested in this, what might be called the secret history of modernism, which is this history of decor and display. And it's a history which includes, but is not exhausted by, works of art. You know, and it's a history, as those of you who are collectors, or those of you, which I'm sure is all of us, who have been to collectors' homes or just live with art that isn't fancy ourselves, you know, like art is one of the things, if we're lucky, that we have in our homes, alongside lots of other things. And one of the things that generally museums and exhibitions do, and some histories of modernism do, is sort of remove all those other things, as well as the spaces that they were in. But I think there are a number of artists working today, contemporary artists, who have picked up, and Josiah would be one, but I didn't show your work here, because I just thought that would be sort of weird. Anyway, but I did choose an artist whom I really love named Virgil Marti, who's a Philadelphia-based artist who actually makes furniture. And, I actually don't know if he blows his own glass, although he's done incredible glass chandeliers. But the piece that I'm showing you here is a piece where he collaborated, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia collaborated with the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which, as many of you will know, is an encyclopedic museum. And Virgil Marti's really interested in storage, in the second-hand and third-hand, inferior, damaged works of art that never get, as it were, out of storage. And it was arranged that he would have access to the storage of all 18th, 19th, and 20th century works, and 21st century probably, in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and that he could basically choose whatever he wanted to make a display, to make an exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art. So it was an unusual situation where you had one museum storage on display in another museum, in a contemporary art museum. And what I'm showing you here is that Marti chose several of these early 19th century busts, mostly marble. One, what is that called? Sorry, the black. No, it's not bronze. I think it's onyx, maybe. Anyway, maybe it's bronze. But he chose these sculptures, and he actually made these poofs, these very furry poofs for them, these pink poofs, in order to give them a certain kind of honorific display that they would never have at the hands of the museum itself, because by connoissorial standards, they're actually inferior. 19th century, even within the standards of 19th century neoclassicism, and even within the standards of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, these are already inferior works. And so he was interested in kind of taking them out of storage. He insisted that they not be cleaned. This was a huge fight he had with conservation, because part of his whole interest was the sort of dusty life of storage that they'd endured, and not cleaning that up. And of course the museum, if they were going to be shown, wanted them shown to best effect. And anyway, so that was, and he got to keep his dust. And then the last image that I'm showing you is a Louise Lawler, two images actually, a Louise Lawler photograph, which she took in the apartment of Yves Saint Laurent, after Yves Saint Laurent died, but before Christie's had totally finished preparing the apartment for photographing for the catalog of the so-called sale of the century. And if you look at what I thought was interesting, if you see a sort of Nautilus sculpture and a bronze, this is a bronze neoclassical sculpture, and then some flowers. But if you look at the second image, you can actually see the scale, which she's blown it up, huge, way, way beyond the scale of the domestic interior, even though Yves Saint Laurent's interior is very grandiose. It's not that grandiose. And so she's actually thinking about the scale like this, the scale of this building. If you look at the ceiling here, the industrial scale of much contemporary art exhibition space, this is the Yvon Lambert Gallery in Paris, as opposed to these sort of private, very grand, but not industrially scaled apartments of someone like Yves Saint Laurent. And so this seemed to be another moment where, to me, an artist was actually kind of honoring or at least thinking about the logic of interior display. At the very moment it's being dismantled, and of course for the pieces to be sold hither and yon, rather than imagining that what art was about was a certain remove or transcendence of the decorative, or for that matter, of the domestic, of the private, whether that private is as sort of glorified or sort of fancy as Yves Saint Laurent, or as what Catherine Dreyer called big middle class interior, that the sort of middle class, happily bourgeois, except for all of the avant-garde modernist art that she had, the sort of proudly middle class interior of Catherine Dreyer. So I think I'll stop there. I hope there's time for some questions.
Thanks, Richard. I wanted to pick up this idea about the gendering of the space that Catherine Dreyer's in, and also note that the Whitney Studio Club, which was on 8th Street downtown in small houses and carriage houses, for their shows in the later 20s, Juliana Force, who was the director, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, mostly painted, as far as I know, the rooms in pale pinks and pale blues and greys, and brought in a lot of furniture and sort of set up an intimate domestic situation. And Bar, well, not quite Myanmar, because the museum's not founded to 29, but even in the first spaces in the Heckscher building, and then later with purpose-built spaces in 1939, is always, is beginning to canonize these white spaces, devoid of architecture or detail and any other appendages. And so when you look at Dreyer, and then you look at the Whitney, and then you compare that with the modern, how much do you see that as being impacted by the fact that these are women who have art in their own domestic spaces? I mean, Juliana Force's collection, which was, she lived a floor above, and soirees were held there often. That too is in an extraordinarily elaborate Victorian interior for a time.
Yeah, you know, I was just looking at mural, the Jackson Pollock mural that's undergoing conservation at the Getty. That was done for Peggy Guggenheim's apartment, and I was thinking about Tuma being done for the exactly for the space above the bookshelf in Catherine Dreyer's New York apartment. I mean, and so that actually when I see it now at Yale, I can't help again but mourn. I mean, just at least the reference. Maybe there's a photo actually. I think there's a photo of it where you see it above the bookshelf, but you could see this was a custom-built work for a particular space, a particular patron's apartment. And I do think, I mean, I wouldn't want to necessarily generalize that it's because, for example, when the Société Anonyme had its first show, Catherine Dreyer asked Marcel Duchamp to decorate the space, and she used that word decorate, and that's where he came up with the black rubber flooring and the lace around which was amazing, and amazing that Jennifer and the Société Anonyme show redid it, except at Yale. But the lace around the paintings and the blue, baby blue, sort of, or blue oilcloth walls. So I don't want to say it's, but I also think obviously we know Duchamp is someone who was really interested in playing with gender roles and also interested in the decorative, or at least in interrogating it. So I think that the gendering is important. I mean, part of what and I didn't do that much deep research, but part of what I learned is that, you know, the idea that we have that women have always been assigned to the task of interior decoration is actually not historically accurate, at least within an English and French context. If you go back to the 18th century, I mean, this also has to do with the fact that usually often the person who built the home was the one who decorated it, and that would most often be a man. But I think that it's a really interesting proposal, and I'm also even more interested, or equally interested, in the idea that it's partially because it's in, if you look at the Société Anonyme show, the apartment that she rented, it has a fireplace, it has a completely domestic logic to the room. It's just that here it's being used as a gallery. And I think I just noticed that when I go to gallery spaces now, a couple of galleries on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, for example, still retain, let's say, the molding, and it's a very, very different sense than when you go to West Chelsea and it's just this huge, space like this. So I think it also has to do with the history of the buildings that, and as you're saying, and whether it comes out of living with the work or showing the work first in your own domestic space and then branching out to a sort of more public one.
Last detail. There's an extraordinary interview with William Rubin, who's head of painting and sculpture department in 1974, and he's being asked about many things, including the presentation of art, and he makes the statement that really the museum is not the best place to look at art, that the best place, the ideal situation, that's his phrase, the ideal situation is an apartment, somewhere where you live with it. And I think he's thinking of even for Pollocks, he says, even for Pollocks. You think of these gigantic Pollocks like Lavender Mist and how they were installed in B.H. Friedman's apartment on, what is it, Central Park South? But really, the Rothkos and the Pollocks are wall to wall. And then there's the coffee tables with African sculpture. So you would never have been able to experience the work in the way that we now think of as absolutely critical to it. So I think that these are, the questions of gender are one thing, and I agree with you, but I think they're also historically specific in a larger sense.
Absolutely.
Just a quick remark in relation to the talk, the talk that I read at the beginning, Catherine Dryer's, which is she sort of neglects interior decoration, and perhaps she, I mean it's a question actually. Doesn't she? Perhaps she's not thinking about interior decoration at all. It's hard. I mean, all the way. I mean, in that fantastic photograph that you included, she herself looks like a piece, But anyhow, yeah.
Hello? Because, in the piece that you read, and I actually quote this, George edited so carefully or helpfully, she rails against interior decorators. She hates the profession of interior decoration, precisely because, Catherine Dreyer that is, precisely because it's become a profession, and she feels that people are being told, you should have a period room, this is what you should have in your house. And she was like, whatever kind of furniture you have, you should be collecting modern art. Do not think that you have to have some kind of modern life in order to live with modern art, or modernist art, we would now say. And what she disliked so much about interior decoration was she felt that, and this is gendered, I think she felt especially because the most influential interior decorators at that time were, well, not women, many of them were women, some men, but she felt that they were taking away from women the right to determine their own domestic surround and to be creative. She actually thought that it was a creative act. She didn't liken it necessarily to making art, but she thought it was very important, and this is where, she talked about the importance of living with modern art, but she talked also about the importance of living with modern art in a space of your own devising, not in a space that you thought matched Léger's studio or matched some magazine article that was telling you how to have, a Louis whatever living room. And so I think that that's where part of my affection for Catherine Dreyer comes out in her sort of do-it-yourself. Not that I do it myself, but I mean, I don't have a decorator, but I like that this attitude she has, which I think is also meaning to be not only for women, but maybe perhaps especially because she's often speaking to all female groups, as she was in your lecture, because there's the invitation she gets in part. I think she wants to be enabling or empowering, and not have people be overly intimidated or instructed by a professional class of decorators.
And specifically towards that end, in the Brooklyn exhibition, and she she set up a series of smaller spaces in which she borrowed furniture from a well-known, it wasn't Abraham and Straus, but it was was it Abraham and Straus? Middle-class furniture store, and brought that furniture into the Brooklyn Museum rather than borrowing furniture from their collection, and installing smaller scale works from the exhibition in a setting so people could envision it as an extension of their own lives. So she wasn't uninterested in decorating, or she wasn't unconscious of it. And when you look at her own interiors, like, how did she absolutely mediate? You know, she's got these incredible lampshades that are like covered with lace next to Duchamp's glass, and it's really fascinating, a kind of ability to edit that none of us have today. But in fact, she felt that if people could, just as you said, that if they felt comfortable as a natural extension of their experience, modernism could win them and change them, as she felt it was so powerful to do. But in the history of Société Anonyme, and another scholar, Christina Wilson, has written very thoughtfully and moved through all of the exhibition strategies that Société Anonyme had during its history, and showed how there was a coming together of a very traditional style, a salon style of presenting art, and then moving towards what we now are very familiar with, this kind of cleaned out bar-esque. We think of it as MoMA, but in fact, Société had done these more spare hangings, so you really could get your eyes around an individual artwork and get your body into it as well. And so that was modeled and questioned throughout their exhibition program.
A ver, I think we go with Michael now. Thank
Hello.
you.
Okay. Thanks, Montse. Maybe a little bit responding to Richard's comments about questions of display and Molly's discussion of fluidity. I was asked to talk a little bit about museums as a topic, and also artists in museums. So I'll try to address both a little bit. I have to say that my whole life grew up with a sense that museums were very strange things from the perspective of art. And I was more interested in the art and always felt this strangeness about museums. And of course, the more I got to know about art history and it being filled with artists and things being made, the stranger the museums often felt to me. And now it's all the rage to try to include a contemporary artwork or something in a historical display to ask that question a little bit. But I don't want to talk about that. I think in some ways that can become a token gesture that tries to include or ask for relevance through a footnote. But this strangeness for me had not to do so much with really disliking the museum, but this alienation, this sense that it was continually narrowing the possibilities for the understanding of art rather than expanding upon them. Definitely that museums didn't seem to me fluid, or to have a fluidity of a sensibility. So after having worked many years at DIA with Lynne Cooke, and having had a chance to experiment with many artists and spend time with artists, I took a chance to work at this museum I'm now at, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which the word was used encyclopedic, which is a strange word. It comes from a sort of enlightenment sense. The museum is a library. But let's just say a museum of all time and all place. So big museum, not a contemporary museum. And so often I'm in these conferences and they're all about contemporary art. And what was very strange about this museum in Los Angeles is that while it had an Egyptian mummy, the museum itself was younger than I was. So there was this funny quality of a museum of old things in a city like Los Angeles that was new and of the future. And that seemed to me to hold a lot of possibilities, to maybe open the question of what museums could be. And a lot of what I've done there, and there are some photographs to refer to, which I can refer to in the package a little bit, was this question of opening the door to other possibilities. And maybe to say something about the strategy or a way of thinking about some of the gestures, a lot of what I thought about was how to, there was this sense of, could I turn things upside down? Maybe inside out, maybe backwards. How could a series of reversals, which was a sort of trick learned in art school about how to think about a problem or open up a creative path, function? And I was very lucky when the first thing I sort of did in trying to throw a wrench into things was ask John Baldessari to install the upcoming, already curated Magritte and Contemporary Art exhibition. And after some discussion, he proposed that the entire exhibition space would have on its floor a carpet of blue sky and clouds, and the ceiling would be wallpaper of LA freeways. And so that the world would be upside down, the visitors would be walking on clouds, and that became the starting point for a series of things he did in the exhibition, and asking the question that I was interested in about having the artist not be contained within, but maybe operating upon the frame. And it seems so wonderful that the first gesture was to turn things upside down. That led to a discussion when I was frustrated with the graphic designer's solutions to our logo of talking to the artist again, in this case someone, John Baldessari, who was very good with that. After a few days, he came back with a simple solution. It's on the slides. That's the only reason I asked that it put on the pictures. No one liked, 5 designers hated LACMA because what do you do with the C, and it's too complicated, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And within 3 days, John said he'd think about it. 3 days later, he calls me back and he said, I got something to show you. And it was a photograph and a drawing that just simply included underlining the L and the A, LA, and made it symmetrical. And I love this idea that then the artists would be working again on the frame. The presentation of the museum to the public was of the artist's design. These reversals seemed to be, they were interesting to me. So another reversal was, could I reverse the timeline? The expectation that you walk into a museum in the past and, you know, struggle your way through to the present. That seemed discordant with the experience I have of the world, which is that I'm in the present and struggle to recover the past. So could you flip the timeline and walk through the door of the present and put contemporary art or artists of the present out front? That led to thinking about the commission to Chris Burden to create the Urban Light sculpture, which is also depicted here. Again, for me, a reversal. I wondered whether the picture of the museum in the guidebook could be an artwork, not a building. So put the artwork out front and the building in the back, which is the opposite of what one would expect in that sense. There was another play with that, which was inside, outside. I love the idea that the outside had the biggest gallery space in Los Angeles, and so these artists would be outside, you'd be in the museum before you were in the buildings. And also that this art, so the art and architecture reversal, the inside and outside. Large-scale sculpture became a great tool to do that. So the Chris Burden, which I always joked was our faux temple facade, as a nod to the Metropolitan Museum's Greco-Roman temple facade. But of course, theirs is faux, neo, ours is real, of LA street lamps made in Los Angeles by an artist from Los Angeles, of 19th century lamps, which were in themselves neoclassical in inspiration, but reconsidered by the artist. So, and also to invite Robert Irwin, who Lynne and I had worked with so closely in the design of Dia Beacon, which was the sort of test of concept of all of this, where Dia Beacon, the museum, was designed not by an architect, but by an artist, and the gardens became a key to the architecture, another reversal. And so if you see in the photograph with Urban Light, the palm trees and the palm garden are Robert Irwin's, the LA artist. I also thought there was a nice idea of local and exotic, because most museums started with the idea of bringing things from far away, so a locality could see them. My favorite gesture, for example, the bringing of the of obelisks, transporting them from Egypt. And in New York, I was always familiar with Cleopatra's Needle, which was taken from Alexandria. So when Michael Heiser called me one day and said he'd seen the most beautiful rock he'd ever seen, this was the Colossi of Memnon in Riverside, California, in diorite granite, just like the Egyptian sculptures. I thought perfect. We have our obelisk, we have our marker, and it's a California artist. It's a local, not, and of course it was transported to the same fanfare actually as the Cleopatra's Needle was in New York, with thousands of people lining the streets in ceremony. Which is another issue of reversal. I think a lot of what the antiseptic quality sometimes of a museum and clearing everything out to absolutes. And when I went to school, the contemporary in MoCA was an ideal because you walked in off the street. But that was also, that was our ideal. But it is to throw out the baby with the bathwater a little bit, because as Michael Heiser knew in Moving the Stone, or Chris Burden knew in Setting Up Urban Light, or Robert Irwin knew in The Gardens, that ceremony is at the core of every artistic tradition, whether it's dance or performance, and some kind of ceremony has to be maintained. Maybe interior decorating has some of that potential too. But maybe just to go a little bit further to the question of display, there was also the question of picture and frame and how a reversal there could make sense. I had a chance to be introduced long ago to Jorge Pardo by Lynne Cooke, who commissioned him to work on a project at DIA, and we worked with him together. And so I reached out to Jorge, who was in Los Angeles, and spent a lot of time at that time in Mexico, and thought I would invite him to work on our pre-Hispanic or pre-Columbian collections, but not to put a piece in the space, nor to curate, not to pick things that he liked, but rather to work on the frame, to see whether the frame was malleable enough to provide a new understanding for these. And there's a beautiful picture in here, although one must see the color of it to see the splendor of that idea. And of course it was very controversial in the museum, because the question was asked, well, to this question of interior decorating, that's not an objective presentation. Of course, taking objects that were buried in Mexico in a station wagon to Los Angeles and putting them in a room painted gray in a square pedestal with plexiglass, I didn't find that objective either in terms of representation of that work. So it seemed that the door was open there for a replacement or a substitution of that, I call it non-objective frame, for something that was not didactic, not critique, but a substitution that opened to new possibilities, which is what Jorge delivered. And then over dinner, talking with Franz West about his work and his ability to think about making objects that have come from performance and what is the nature of display of an object that's used in a performance. That's exactly the problem we always have, for example, with tribal arts, or in the case of our Oceanic Tribal Arts collection, objects that were meant for dance and then seem to die in the still presentation of the museum. So he was invited, and there's a slide of that, a picture of that, to make this installation. He painted the walls with green tea. He made very inexpensive bases, which he designed and sent to us by email, which we rebuilt for no money. And it is a very lively and often requested display by students as well as visitors. So this idea of reversals and exchanges activated by artists seemed to me to hold enormous potential. It still does. I think one of the things it does, like these questions of how a work is presented in a white cube or interior decoration in a home, is ask questions about the multiplicity of viewpoint. And this, I think, holds enormous power. In fact, the future of the museum now is asking an architect, not an artist, but an architect, to reconsider this on a broad scale, what the nature of the frame is, and to hope for this idea of a kind of simultaneity of point of view, a fluidity, if that's a possible word in this context, about what a museum can be, to be many things, or to see one thing from many perspectives. In the work that I commissioned from Barbara Kruger, and that's pictured in this package to end with, I asked her to work on the Broad building, which I found quite dry and empty, and did not want didactics at the beginning again, but rather an artwork. So she created a 90-foot tall mural that functions as the main circulation device with the elevator of the museum. And it is all about pictures and frames, and the text on the side is a list of things that the work, she doesn't say work of art, work could be, the first being is about the frame and the confines, is about the frame and the confines of articulate space. It ends the long list with and shopping and the image of perfection, maybe to bring us to the art fair. And finally, to bring us back right here, the clue for me to all of this was a project in 1970 that Robert Irwin made, which was not really an artwork, but he was asked to do the design for the NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration Conference on the habitability of space. And in this conference, he made 3 changeable environments of varying levels of discomfort and taste and smell and sight, in which to have the discussion to make the point that the environment matters. As we are here, and Josiah, you've told us again in the present in this fantastic project, which, like all of these other things, sort of suggests that there's no such thing as a frame that delimits or separates, but is part of a fluid continuum of seeing. Thanks.
Michael, go first.
Fluids rock, right? I've got a couple of questions, but one has to do with the permanence of the installations you're asking these artists to make. Because at some point, they might not look dated, but museums like to renovate, you know, and rejig. And so do you have a lifespan in mind for these rooms, or?
For the rooms inside?
Yeah, are they going to look like period rooms someday?
Well, yeah, I can just be very direct. I mean, obviously, we're not likely to move the 350-ton rock by Michael Heiser anytime soon because of its lack of convenience to move. Some museums have asked for it on loan. And when I talked to Chris Burden even about that, we asked whether it would be temporary or permanent. Actually, the public has decided it's likely to be permanent, and so the suggestion has made that it will become that. Jorge's project was specifically designed not to be permanent. It was controversial enough. There was a near mutiny among the curatorial staff over it. But the idea was, and then it will go away. It actually hasn't gone away yet because a lot of other people have embraced it. Some of the younger curators, an incoming curator who's actually from Mexico City has also suggested that it has a lot of life left in it and that we might maybe even travel the frame sometime rather than the objects or with the objects. So, and Franz West equally is considered temporary. So there's no, there's no specific time limit, but it seemed they should persist beyond the frame of a 3-month exhibition, but not be considered permanent because, yes, they could look, who knows, they could look that way.
I had a question that sort of dovetails with that. And it comes from a place of really being excited by these crossovers, you know, the artist as exhibition display or display person or as remaking the outside of the museum. But I do wonder about what it does to the culture of professionalization. So that when you have, for example, John Baldessari redoing your graphic, your logo, rather than a graphic, but you have, I'm assuming, I mean, I'm sure, you have graphic designers on staff. Or you have, you know, like with Magritte, you said the show was already curated, and then an artist was brought in, Baldessari, to do the installation. I'm just wondering what that does then to the professional, let's say, job description of the curator or the exhibition designer or the graphic designer.
So whatever that, the curator, the museum director, the structure of the museum is always collaboratively engaged deeply. So, for example...
But if you say, this is the person who's going to be curating, not you, that's...
I don't actually say it that way. It is negotiated, and in that case, the curator, Stephanie Barron, worked especially closely with John, and it became a collaboration at the suggestion. Jorge's project was similarly preceded by many trips, 3 trips to Mexico with the curator, looking at displays of pre-Columbian art, and then having some good tequila and discussing it. I can say in that case, it ended in tension rather than celebration, but you never know how these things happen. And then also in the case of the Franz West, there was a curator who was engaged there, and then in the outside spaces, I'm the client curator as well. So it's never without negotiation and discussion with the museum. Although the museum as a whole tends to not want these interventions because they're inefficient and open-ended. So my job has been to force a little bit the possibility that they can happen.
That's my next question. So don't you have any curators who are interested in working with artists?
Well, our contemporary curators certainly do all the time, but more and more that's a little bit what I'm finding, that the success of some of these has interested curators in even talking to artists as well.
I'm wondering if there's a line you won't cross. I mean, how far can it go? That, for example, even this display by Jorge, I think I would leave that exhibition and remember more the display than the objects on display. You know, when you go through the museum, I went this morning through the museum here, the Archaeological Museum, and, you know, it's very dark, and so the objects themselves are brightly lit. You nearly stumble getting around them, but emblazoned in my mind's eye is that object, not how it was installed in the gallery necessarily.
Well, I can be very direct. Again, my job is to force the possibility of experimentation and even failure. The great lesson of the Art and Technology Project of 1970, of which the Habitability Conference came out of, was that certain things are beautiful failures and they teach us things. So I do force the possibility of doing things, but then it is really, the curators have massive expertise. They know exactly what they're doing in their areas, and so, you know, obviously it's not going to last long if they're not interested. And so it is a dialogue to bring that expertise together with what artists do well, and also most curators aren't trained as designers. That's not necessarily their expertise. So there's this back and forth. And so my job is to open the door, and then it seems to be working out that curators are taking that on. And again, you can't fight that. You have to work with it. So I don't know where the lines are. It will depend on the curators, not on me, once the door is open, if that makes sense.
You know, there's a bad tradition of, there was a collector of paintings by Degas who, he had 30 paintings by Degas, but when he brought them home, he added little figures into the pictures because he said, when they complained, he said, well, I own the pictures, they're mine. I mean,
well, and as you know, Chinese always stamp ownership on pictures, changing it over time.
Yeah.
The Japanese who own Chinese pictures don't. We're doing a show of Chinese paintings from Japanese collections for that reason. Yeah. And I think these are just open questions in terms of, you know, the Jorge Pardo display has been actually quite effective. It doesn't seem to have diminished at all. The people who are most tough on that are the educators, because they want the objects to stand forward, and they seem to now really like it. And the Franz West is almost a home run. It actually magnifies and enhances. So I don't know that it always means that it's against the work. It's not intended that way. It's intended to reconsider.
Okay, I think we should have a break. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody that already present, and thank you for the questions.